Thank you so much for being here. So let me introduce the speakers first of all. Next to me is David SYED, partners at Dentons. Then we have also here with us, great to have her, Ms. Couro, KANE-JANUS, Chief Advisor and Analytic Officer, IFC Assistant Treasurer. We have Marie-Laure MAZAUD, Chief Executive Officer at STOA, and David SYED, Abbas HUSSEIN, that's done, Western Regional Head of PAF MENAP Standard Chartered Bank. Thank you so much for being here to all of you, and thanks so much for coming here. We will have some more visitors who are just probably finishing their coffees and they don't know what they're missing about here. Now, during this session, we're going to try to go into some way of three parts. Sasha, talking about emerging markets and the sustainability revolution to drive infrastructures is clearly the conversation that could keep us going for at least one afternoon. We're going to try to be rather brief, and we're going to try to leave some time for everybody here who would want to ask a question and join this. Now, to set the scene and to start this conversation, I'll bring you some stats that by 2040, the world faces a $15 trillion gap between projected investment and the amount needed to provide adequate infrastructure. And emerging markets will account for nearly 2/3 of that investment need. And the financing that they require could increase further. Now, this is already quite stunning in terms of the stats, and this is where we're going to take it. And the first question will go to Ms. Couro Janus. In the current changing landscape and emerging threats, how are responsible practices and sustainability factors being embedded into your global operations?
Good afternoon, and I'm very happy to be here in this panel, to have the opportunity to speak with you. Thank you, Sasha, for the question. As we are facing unprecedented challenges, situation in the world and the changing landscape, to start with, I would just want to start with the Ukrainian war. So the war in Ukraine has really stretched the gap in SDGs even further. As a result of rising prices and food insecurity, it is becoming a bigger problem and disproportionately hitting the poorest in the world. The World Bank estimates that for every 1% increase in food prices, this will push an additional 10 million people into extreme poverty. It is also estimated that 789 million people don't have access to reliable electricity. Around 3 billion people are using unsustainable or polluting fuels to heat or cook. And last statistic I want to share is approximately 2.2 billion people lack access to safe water. So this inadequate ports, routes, and transportation is also holding back growth and trade. The World Bank Group has pledged around 170 billion for the next 15 months to respond to rising food insecurities and other economic stress that affects, mostly the emerging market countries due to the Ukrainian war. We need to do something urgently to help provide emergency food supplies and deploy financial support to households and countries to facilitate and trade, invest in sustainable food production and nutrition security, and also support infrastructure finance. Fragility is not just linked to the Ukrainian war. We have around 39 out of 189 countries who are members of the World Bank Group who are really in fragile or are experimenting conflict and are remaining unworryingly fragile. So those ongoing conflicts in Afghanistan, Ethiopia, Somalia, Yemen, etc., are also driving up risk perception and pricing and increasingly restricting capital and constraining investment opportunities. So public resources are very stretched due to the COVID situation, and the IMF, for instance, estimate that 60% of low-income countries are really very close to debt distress or are already in debt distress. So rising prices coupled with rising interest rates are pushing those countries to the limit. We've seen the case in Sri Lanka, for instance. So the World Bank Group and IMF have pledged with the G20 to offer debt relief to distressed countries. The debt service suspension has provided 13 billion in debt service payment for over 48 countries during the pandemic. So there is more to do. and private capital mobilization is a priority and remains a priority for IFC. All that to say that for every $1 that IFC lends to its borrowers, we mobilize $1 from our other investors. So the target is really to double mobilization in the future. So collectively, we have mobilized roughly $160 billion from the private sector since 2016, and we are committed to continue to offer long-term financing and sustainability-linked financing. So this is together with the industry-leading expertise that we do provide with partnering with the private sector. And we not only look into financing, but we also look into providing, making sure that environment standards are met. So IFC has put a lot of effort in mainstreaming climate smart solutions in infrastructure to keep businesses viable, safeguard jobs, and recover sustainably from COVID-19. We are leading in the development of the impact investing market via standard setting through our operating principles for impact measurement, through our corporate governance framework, and also through performance standards. So the research, again, shows that we can generate 23 trillion investment in and opportunities in climate that would create 213 million cumulative jobs and achieve 4 billion tons of CO2 reduction in developing countries. So what this means is we can help our clients tap into those opportunities and catalyze finance for the climate action, which is at the core of what we do. So IFC, for instance, has delivered 32% of its own account in climate finance and mobilized $3.6 billion for this year. I wanted to give two examples that are really relevant. One is the utility, the platform we call U4C, Utilities for Climate. It's a global platform that marries advisory and investment solutions. This is a climate-focused model that where our IFC is working with utilities, chosen utilities around the world, to create and expand a global network. So positioning those utilities company into really strong partners and leaders in the fight against climate change. The program has supported, for instance, the utility company in Izmir, Turkey, İSSU, and provided 30 million in investments to support water supply, wastewater, and the stormwater project. And also the the water utility in Brazil with 56 million in investment. So what is interesting, for instance, in this example I was sharing with Turkey, is the work the advisory is doing. In addition to the investment, this was a sustainability-linked investment, a bond. So the coordinator, the sustainability coordinator, is really working hand in hand with the utility company to provide advisory. And then there was some gender targets linked to that loan. In doing so, the team is exploring capacity building with İSSU to develop a gender strategy and also an action plan that would include communication trainings and attract more women in the technical field. Let me stop here and back to you, Sasha.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much for that. Let me take now the question to Abbas Hussein. Now, the past few months have been specifically turbulent, so to say, and some of those aspects have been listed, and we just heard it from IFC, but we're also facing all the significant inflation, the increase in interest rates, some looming threats of recession. Now, let me get your view on when it comes on the Standard Chartered Bank outlook of the region from a geographic sector perspective and impact of current macroeconomic environment on the project's and national objectives.
Thanks, Sasha. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. In the Middle East and North Africa region, energy transition is the top priority right now. If you look at end of 2020, the entire region had an installed capacity of 24 gigawatts, which only represents 1% of the world's capacity. But over the last couple of years, we've seen some massive projects all across the region with world record tariffs. And if you look at the guidelines, the objectives of all the countries, everybody set very, very ambitious targets, starting from Saudi Arabia, the largest economy in the region. They plan to add 58 gigawatts of power by 2030. The plan is that half of the energy will come from renewables. Look at UAE, very, very similar, 50% target as well by 2050. Even smaller countries in the region, such as Oman, have set very aggressive targets, 30% by 2030. And when we get into North Africa, even more aggressive targets. Morocco has a target of 70% by 2040, and Egypt is targeting 40% plus. So very, very ambitious targets. Generally speaking, we're seeing mostly solar, some wind, pockets of Morocco, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, but it's primarily solar-driven. So this trend will continue. We've seen world record tariffs, and there's an economic rationale for that. Just last year, we saw solar at 1 cent. It was a world record, 1.04 cents. If you compare that with any other fuel, even with the abundant resources of the Middle East, it's a small fraction of the cost. So we will see the continued growth. Reason being, plenty of land in the Middle East. Even a 1,000 megawatt solar project, which we structured a couple of years, required 43 square kilometers of land. So no shortage of land. Middle East, North Africa has the highest solar radiation in the world. We've got access to labor, logistics, infrastructure is appropriate. Long-term financing readily available in the Middle East. We've seen financing at 27, 28 years. And very, very importantly, there's a lot of interest amongst the private sector to come and develop these projects. So solar wind projects will be the backbone of the power sector going forward. We heard a lot of panelists refer to green hydrogen earlier this morning, and Middle East will be no different. Various forecasts could be a $2.5 trillion industry by 2050. $15 trillion investment required by 2015 could displace 25% of the world's oil by 2050. So we see various forecasts. Middle East itself and North Africa has planned already $45 billion of green hydrogen projects. Out of the 45 billion, 30 plus will be operational by 2030. So hydrogen would be a key enabler for the energy transition all across the region, led by Saudi, and now we are seeing projects being announced in Oman, Egypt, as well as UAE. And thirdly, I would say waste to energy, a relatively new sector in the Middle East. We haven't seen much. The reality is 95% of waste goes to landfill. So very, very little waste is recycled. 150 million tons of waste in the region, and only 5% is recycled. The waste per person is the highest in the world, 2 kgs per person per day. So this is a sector which we have seen project financed the last couple of years. In fact, last year was the largest waste to energy project in the world in Dubai, which would save equivalent of 65 million tons of CO2 over the next 25 years. And it diverts 60% of the entire waste in Dubai into one waste to energy project. So likewise, we are seeing an implosion of waste to energy projects all across. We've got a few in Abu Dhabi. And of course, Saudi Arabia has got the biggest market with more than $20 billion of waste to energy projects planned. Thank you.
Thank you so much. David Syed, partner at Dentons. Let me take it to you now. Well, quite often infrastructure investments are seen as better able than other investments to withstand some of these pressures. And yet, from your experience, how do you consider the level of indebtedness of emerging countries, but specifically also Latin America and in Africa?
Thanks, Sasha. I think at the moment we're facing an interesting paradigm, which is short, medium, and long-term objectives are kind of all colliding. And Couro, made it a very good presentation of the macro situation in terms of issues of hunger, issues of sanitation, so very basic kind of human needs. And then, here Abbas is talking about, very sophisticated, waste to energy and solar projects in the Middle East. So I think Latin America has a bit of everything. It's really, and I would say the same for Africa. So the current crisis is clearly pushing short-term issues to the fore. I think we saw that already last year. Going back to last year's themes, we saw it last year with the health situation, and where there was a lot of energy and resources and financing diverted from maybe more long-term infrastructure projects to healthcare, including immediate healthcare projects. And I think one of the issues we face through the region is not just sustainability as in sustainability goals, but sustainability as in continuing down a path despite whatever comes at you from left or field or from wherever else. So I think at the moment what we're seeing, starting with Latin America, is a very interesting situation where there's a lot of diversity. We talk about Latin America, Mexico is in one situation, Argentina is another situation. You have countries like Brazil, which are giants, which are going through a political potential change now, and that's going to impact a lot in terms of what we see in the region. And then we have the Caribbean region as well. But one thing that we're seeing across Latin America is the high cost of energy, inflation, rising debt, as you correctly said, is putting tremendous pressure on basic needs. So there's a huge tension at the moment. The other thing we're seeing is, very interesting programs being put together by the IFC, the World Bank, et cetera, to address some of these issues, including the public-private kind of partnership idea, including on the financing sector. But we're also seeing that, China and other bilateral and also multilateral creditors, but non-traditional ones, are very active in the region, and we see that in Africa as well. And we see a continuing lack of coordination. In fact, what we're seeing is even less coordination maybe than we saw previously. Finally, capital markets. We're seeing some very interesting, innovative, and I've been working on a couple of them, instruments coming to the fore, which are long-term, which I think is very, very important for some of these projects. And actually, they're not project-focused, they're environmentally focused mainly. And I'm talking about the blue bonds, the blue bond that Belize did last year, very, very interesting, where actually an NGO took over the indebtedness of a country, which is, I think, pretty much a first, so that the coastline will be effectively preserved for posterity. We're seeing 2 more of those projects. One, Barbados just did one. We just got hired by a big South American country to do a new one. I can't mention it yet because it's not public. So that's another very interesting trend, which I think goes with the green bond, the blue bond, the sustainability, the gender bond drive, which we're seeing in South America. We're seeing less of that for the moment in Africa, but I see no reason that couldn't be also expanded to the African market.
Right, as you all have said, the trends and the current situation sort of setting the scene, this is where you also highlighted all the challenges, and let's talk a little bit more about those. Abbas was saying, first, let's go into the financing, the usual challenge that is just growing ever more important. With some of the world's largest projects financing in the region, how are the deals being financed, and what are those challenges and the key success factors that you are seeing from your standpoint?
Thanks, Sasha. So I think over the years, we've seen financing for these large infrastructure/power projects change. Back in the early 2000s, with these large petrochemical, LNG, and even power projects, there were a whole bunch of commercial banks who could just lend long-term, clean, amortizing facilities. And that went on for a number of years. Highly rated, high sovereign ratings, exported petrochemicals, LNG, plenty of demand for that. Post-2008, the project finance market has changed drastically, especially in the Middle East, I would say. Basically, we don't have those 30, 40 banks left anymore. There's just a handful of project finance banks who can lend long-term. So the role of ECAs, the European ECAs, the Japanese ECAs, the Korean ECAs has become a lot more critical. The role of multilaterals, DFIs, especially in countries which are below investment grade, has become extremely critical. And then we've seen Chinese liquidity, where there is any Chinese content in the Middle East with very, very large commitments. And then we have the local banks in certain countries, but local banks at times can only lend into local currency. So financing has become a lot more challenging. We are looking at different options now. We've even got fixed rate investors from the Far East for certain infrastructure projects. I think the key over here is commercial banks' ability to lend in long term. That has been impacted. I think commercial banks generally would like to have shorter dated facilities and not hold an asset for 25, 27 years. So the key difference, the key change over the past few years is that 20-year amortizing facility is just not there anymore. Where we moved on was the amortizing facility into what we call a soft mini-perm, where after 6-7 years, the pricing goes up. There's a dividend block, so even though contractually you're lending long-term, there's a very, very strong incentive for the sponsors to refinance these assets. So from amortizing, went to soft mini-perm. And from soft mini-perm, what we're seeing now is what we see in the other developed markets is a shorter dated hard mini-perm where the financing is only 4, 5, 6 years. And the intention is that you finance the construction. Commercial banks, project finance banks understand how construction risk works, but eventually you take that out through capital markets. So we are seeing that the second largest deal in the first half of this year globally has been the 49% privatization of Saudi Aramco's gas pipelines. That was a short-term financing where banks lend more than $15 billion, not an issue. But eventually this is going to be taken out by our capital markets. Abu Dhabi, if you see on the solar side, or we just closed a underwater subsea transmission facility, again, 5 years, 6 years. And what that does is, number one, your cost of financing obviously is reduced. That benefit is passed on to the off-taker in terms of a lower tariff. You attract more liquidity because you don't need a pure project finance bank to do a 4-year facility. And when you attract liquidity, you get more developers bidding for a particular project. So it works in the favor of the off-taker to have this shorter dated facility. Having said that, it works both ways. At times, the off-taker needs to give some kind of a protection on the refinancing risk, which sponsors as well as lenders are taking. So if I were to summarize, I'd say we have to move towards the shorter dated facilities. I'm not saying every project has to be financed on a 4-year basis. But if you look at the outlook just for MENA, just on the energy side, between oil, gas, petrochemicals, and power, next 4 years, we have $875 billion of projects planned and committed. And this doesn't even include the infrastructure financing or the PPPs. There's just not enough liquidity, to my mind, to finance all these projects on a 27-year financing. We have to move towards an appropriate risk sharing between the off-taker as well as the banks, and where it's feasible, especially for the larger projects. We did a project last year where Standard Chartered was the advisor, $12 million integrated gasification combined cycle in Saudi, where we used a 7-year hard mini-perm for the first time. So liquidity is not the same, which it used to be a few years back. We have to look at every deal, every country, case by case. But I do feel commercial banks will find it more and more difficult going forward to lend 25, 27 years long term.
Thank you so much. Marie-Laure, MAZAUD, that's a question to you too, because you've got the examples as well of some of those financing cases. Could you share them?
Yeah. I think on our side, what we have seen is also some public national bank moving forward, especially in Latin America, where they have built up a system of privatization of infrastructure, notably in Colombia and in Brazil. And if I were to take one example, we just closed the Metro Line 6 in São Paulo back in July this year with BNDES, a $3 billion overall financing, the largest in Latin America ever done. Half of it was grants from São Paulo State, 40% from BNDES, back during the construction phase, partially by local banks, so a pool of international and local banks providing counter guarantees on the construction risk, so sharing the construction risk with BNDES. So it was the first inter-creditor agreement never ever negotiated with BNDES, and it takes quite a lot of time. It took us quite a while to get on board. And in the meantime, there's been bridge financing put in place during almost a 2-year construction period, where we had to provide counter guarantee to allow the long-term financing to take place. So you need to be patient. You need to be also, I think, convinced by the fact that you will get in. And it was clearly not obvious with up and down, but I think with Acciona also on board and us, we succeed in convincing BNDES to get this first non-recourse financing in place, and it's a mixture of grant equity and public long-term financing backed by a commercial bank during the construction period, plus an infra debenture. I think otherwise, I think what we see in the market, especially in Africa, is more infra-like project and smaller project taken place since 2020, since this year, obviously. We have not in our pipeline very big infra project under development. There is some tender, but for like KG, so Kampala-Jinja Expressway. But I think we were qualified back in May 2018, I think. And now, you know, the tender and the dialogue is taking place. So, you know, it takes time and quite a long time. But on the other project, like the infra-like project, there is, I think, two types. I can mention, usually we put equity first to be able to embark also local banks and international banks or DFIs thereafter. I think that was the case of, for example, on the CNI side, Daystar, which just sold to Shell, but the last 2 years, I think we started putting equity, then we get IFC a long-term facility in place. And if I were to take another example, which is Metro Fiber Network, which is in South Africa, we have double, you know, this summer, the revolving credit facility, so it's more short-term, it's a 5-year facility, the equivalent in ZAR in $300 million to provide, I think, financing for internal and external growth because the market is going into consolidation rapidly. And obviously, you know, the 3 rounds of capital increase we participate were obviously a good sign on the banking side to continue to support and double their commitment.
David, let me get to you. I feel like I'm asking you this question every year for the Infraweek, but that's because this question is as important as it was last year, and it's going to be as important next year, because of course one of the biggest challenges is often the confusing regulatory environment, and we have to emphasize yet again the importance of it. Now, how the public policies and regulations participating in the sustainable agenda in emerging markets?
So it's a very good question, and it changes year to year, but it needs actually consistency. That
it's
really
like
needs
an annual assessment of.
Exactly, it needs consistency. No, I think actually, and Marie-Laure made 2 very interesting comments, because the 2, Colombia and Brazil, are good examples of countries where there's been I wouldn't say a totally successful, but a successful series of privatizations, which have been financed in a commercial manner with support, obviously, from the multilateral community, IFC and others. So there's countries that have implemented quite liberal policies and are going towards, I would say, a privatization. There's countries that are going the other way, and actually Colombia is going to be quite interesting now with Petro, the new, you know, which ways is that going to go? Hard to tell for the moment. But at the same time, you also need, it's all very well to have a regulatory environment. You actually need a physically, you're Ukrainian, Sasha, you know, you need a physical level of security as well. And that is actually an issue in Latin American countries as well. There's countries such as Colombia that have had a very stable, I would say, regulatory environment, but have had a very unstable political and security situation. So that also needs to be addressed. And, you know, we'll see how that goes with this new peace initiative, which is going to be quite interesting, actually, and hopefully will be successful. So, yes, South America, Latin America absolutely needs a consistent path which allows, you know, secure financing. Some countries are better than others. Some countries have a more stable environment than others. The World Bank, actually, and IFC, and also regional multilaterals have been working on these. There's various initiatives that are ongoing to harmonize. there's actually even currently a bill that is being promoted in Congress in the States to put a regional development plan together for the first time, where the U.S. would try to lead the way. We'll see where that gets to. You never know with these congressional, where it's going to actually get to, whether it's going to get voted or not. But it's an interesting concept, right? And of course, you have the sub-regional banks. For example, you have one very active bank at the moment is Corporación Unida de Fomento in the Andean Pact region that's really trying to put together a regional plan with very, very specific regulatory changes that the countries would have to put into place. And potentially, depending on who wins in Brazil as well, you have a kind of a renaissance of the Mercosur, which was the southern. So, simple answer is there are initiatives. I think there's a lot of room for hope. I think also you're going to see countries like Venezuela, which are large energy producers, come back into the kind of Western fold, which I think can help the region quite a lot, because that one of the critical issues is energy security. It's a patchwork. It's a patchwork is the answer.
Yeah, and certainly a strong regulatory environment is something that is really needed to work for better public-private partnerships as another aspect. Abbas Hussein, let me ask you on that one. Would you give me the Standard Chartered update on social economic infrastructure projects across the regions in progress, and what are the active sectors? Let's look at that one.
Thanks. So historically, the region, in terms of project financing and private investment, has been restricted to the energy sector. So we've seen massive investments in LNG, petrochemicals, pipelines, and on the power sector side. And the IPP is a PPP, and the region's had a very, very successful track record all the way since 1994. I think we have probably more than 75, 80 IPPs up and running, investments from Europe, Middle East, Far East, all across. The PPP sector has just recently picked up. In fact, over the last 3 years, Saudi Arabia passed a law / amended a PPP law just last year. 2020 was Qatar, and 2019 was Abu Dhabi. So all the regional countries have now have a regulation in place. They've always had big plans, but for some reason, we didn't see much progress. But over the last couple of years, we're seeing activity all across. If you start off from Saudi Arabia wants to diversify from oil. They have a 2030 vision program under which PPPs are a big, is one of the core areas of diversifying the economy. So it's all across. They've got 16 healthcare initiatives. There's PPPs on the transportation side. We're seeing car parks being now structured on a PPP basis. Education and healthcare. So the biggest program, I would say, is in Saudi Arabia. If you look at Abu Dhabi Investment Office started in 2019. It's a little focus in terms of PPPs in what sectors. Accommodation, a $2 billion accommodation structured on a PPP basis for ADNOC. That's being bid out end of this year. They have a very unique project, which was actually just bid out a couple of months back, street lighting. Street lights, replacing current street lights with 140,000 LED lights. Small project, but it saves 76% efficiency. Schools being privatized in Abu Dhabi. So there's a massive PPP program all across. And even if you go to the smaller countries, Oman has got plans for 9 schools. Bahrain itself has got a $30 billion program on infrastructure, which includes highways and metros. So we see a lot of growth in this sector going forward all across the region.
Thank you. Marie-Laure MAZAUD, now the other point here and the other important aspect is something that you said earlier when we discussed this session just a couple of minutes ago, is the need to anticipate and preempt studies as well. Would you evolve more on that?
Yeah, I think in an environment which is driven by climate, biodiversity, natural-based and nature-based solution, more and more, and resilience, I think the need to anticipate and invest in study upfront is really critical, and it's, I think, massive money, time, and substantial work to be done upfront. I think to meet with standard that in the meantime usually evolve. So you know, it's difficult to track and follow. I think that's a very important item because we're talking about millions of euros to be put at risk by developers. You know, usually on part with government before getting on board, and there is no certainty whether or not you will meet the biodiversity criteria of the DFIs, which especially on critical habitats. So it can be quite cumbersome and a long journey before you reach, you know, an agreement. But more also importantly, even if you have done that, then after you enter into you know, the project itself and the construction itself, and you know, what is not sized very well at the beginning is how sizable the ENS team should be to deal not only with environment, but also social aspect, skill that need to be developed on ground, traction to have people remaining on site, to follow up on action plan and program with affected people, you know, tackling with their local reality and expectation at the right path. So it's really not, you know, it's really a long way to deal with. And I think moreover, you have also to deal with you know, social acceptability of the project to limit tension, investigation, and complaints. So I can give you some example. For example, in Brazil, where we have project on part with Voltalia, they've set up La Casa Voltalia, which allowed the local community to address their concern and have an open, you know, and transparent dialogue. It has been put in place for some years, and it's proved to be very, I think, efficient. On another project we have in Dominican Republic, we have conducting on part with other utilities, national study to establish, you know, the community of certain bats, which otherwise will prevent us, I think, to operate and put in burns certain of our park. Some of our friends have been, you know, had difficulties to deal with this issue with the lenders. And so we decided to join together our efforts and to put in place a $1 million, you know, study to evaluate what is the species of this bass in the country, and determine that is not critical, I think, species. So, you know, I have a lot of example, I think, of this kind. But what I think I recommend a lot is also to lenders to come on grounds more often to be able to see what the effort that are put in place by the SPVs that are running this project and the shareholder behind, and also balance between what is the priority to get deals done, erected and completed, and what can be managed over time.
Thank you. Let's go a little bit into the future prospects, and also something that in some studies is called the big shake-up, because benefiting from emerging opportunities calls for more active investing and thinking outside of the box and outside of some of the templates that we might all have. Ms. Couro, KANE-JANUS, now the question goes to you. The capital markets would greatly contribute to mobilizing savings for investment in infrastructure. How is the IFC leveraging capital markets and mobilizations innovations to finance sustainable infrastructure projects?
So maybe I start by echoing a bit what Abbas was saying of the importance of capital market as a conduit to relate savings from institutional investors such as pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, insurance companies to sustainable investments such as in infrastructure, for instance. So our challenge is to increase investors' allocation to developing countries through our capital market activities, through our investment vehicles, and through blended finance. So when we think that 8% of 8% of insurance company money, only 8%, and 2% of pension fund money goes into investment in developing economies, this is very little. So what are we doing? We are looking at it in two fronts. One is looking at a new set of investors, and then the second one I would like to share is a bit about the managed co-lending portfolio platform we have. So the new sets of investors we are targeting are threefold. First one, capital market impact investors, insurance companies, as I mentioned, and then local banks or providers of local currency. In the capital market impact investment world, there is an increased appetite for impact investments that deliver tangible impact. So the studies have shown that if we were only to reach out to capital markets for infrastructure financing, we can more than double what is being done as of now. So our aim is always to create sustainable capital markets. We work with other DFIs and IFIs to provide advisory services and work upstream to enable the regulatory environment and to be able to attract, to overcome the issues actually around project development and improve the climate for investors to join us and mobilize more private capital. We have always been at the cutting edge of creating green and social. We've been the first issuers in the market of green and social bonds, and we continue to maintain those standards today. We are working with more borrowers, actually, to issue under those same standards, to mobilize also other investors to come and participate in those issuances. In addition, we are also using our syndication platform to measure impact and to have more co-lenders join us there. The insurance companies are becoming a big, growing areas actually for DFIs. It helps us buy down risk. So there are a lot of investment, for instance, in emerging market financial institutions, whereas a private finance institution don't want to join in because of the risk. In those instances, what we do is we provide borrowers with funding from our own balance sheet and then work with insurance companies for risk appetite, to buy down the risk, basically. We also, right now, are working with over a dozen insurance companies to enable more great lending through banks financing, et cetera. I mentioned earlier local banks and the importance of local currency. We've seen it now with the dollar going up and the other countries having to cope up. So we can limit borrowers' exposure to FX risk by providing more sustainable financing solutions. Around 30% of our current debt program now is in local currency, and we have lent in 60 different local currencies. So we do syndicate local currencies alongside our own capital in over a dozen countries. So thanks to partnerships with local banks and some impact investors. And we also help countries mobilize more domestic savings for long-term investors in the SDGs. I mentioned the MCPP, the Managed Co-Lending Portfolio Program that was started in 2013 in IFC. This idea was really how can we look at a replicable vehicle and that is scalable as well to bring in co-investors, not on a one project-by-project basis, but on a portfolio basis. So since the MCPP has been created, we have mobilized around 10 billion and deployed over 215 projects in 56 countries. We have allowed our co-investors to take on more emerging market risks on a funded and unfunded basis. And right now, there is also models of MCPP using credit that has been replicated by other developmental banks such as FMO, etc. Last but not least, I wanted to touch upon the last MCPP project that we've been working on, which is the MCPP One Planet. It was launched at Glasgow, and it is 3 billion capital attracted from institutional investors that we leverage on our reporting, impact reporting abilities, and it is the first world global EM loan portfolio that will be 100% aligned with the Paris Climate Agreements.
Thank you so much. When it comes to calls for more active investing. That's, of course, also a very complex issue with lots of factors in there. And one of them also, that's the question to Marie-Laure MAZAUD, that's the question of the need for new financial actors to support. You said the club is too closed on that one, and there is this need. Do tell more about this club that is too closed, and how can we change that?
Yeah, I think what we have experienced is often that, especially in African market, we deal with DFIs mainly, and with some of the local banks, depending. But I think international commercial bank is not there yet, or capital market not also. And I think, so what we now experience is less big project coming to the market because the public external debt has just raised like hell with 2 years of COVID, and now the Ukrainian ratio, crisis. So the ability of the public sector to borrow long term and to provide gap facility funding is not just yet, is not there yet and anymore. And they're more focused on dealing with the basic need of the population to fulfill and provide stability to with price, oil price, gas price, and to avoid any social movement or riots as a result. And so what we've seen in terms of shift is more infra-like or smaller project taken place. So more B2B project like CNI platform being developed to distribute energy and electricity to corporate under corporate PPP or to commercial services corporation. And the example is a county platform that we've just closed that provides solar solution to CMEs and focusing in India and in South Africa, where the industrial market is more developed, and there is clearly some needs and focus towards a better mix of energy. Or the other one, like Serengeti, which is a renewable platform. We participate through a capital increase with other partners to support a mini hydro and solar project, but that are more developed under a by-agreement basis. So more distributed energy to the local population to allow to cope with the gaps Couro was talking about, and to facilitate the access to electricity of population that are desperately needs it, and that are paying a heavy price per kilowatt hour today because it's done with a fuel generator. Clearly that's the trend that we are seeing today.
Right, we have touched upon quite a few trends here. We will have to hurry up, but briefly I would like the final round to all the speakers, and we're going to start with you, Abbas. So we discussed the sort of the current environment situation. We touched upon the challenges, and we try to look ahead as much as possible, of course. But what's your main thoughts and the take when it comes to how exactly, when it comes to the emerging markets, the sustainability revolution can drive infrastructures? Your final thoughts.
As I mentioned a little earlier, that energy transition is the top priority of the region. Despite inflation, despite supply chain disruption, despite increase in interest rates, these projects are all across very, very economically viable, even with the increase in solar prices. We're seeing electricity which can be produced at 2 cents. Green hydrogen I mentioned as well. 70% of the cost of green hydrogen is actually renewables, and in the Middle East, you have the lowest cost of renewables. So green hydrogen is very viable, even when you convert it into ammonia and ship it all the way across to Europe or the US. So I would expect, despite the challenges which we are facing, inflation, global issues, that Middle East will lead the initiative of renewables, green hydrogen going forward.
Thank you so much.
I think I think more projects dedicated to local communities. You know, big towns. There is very big towns in country like Africa, outside the megalopole. So more smaller projects dedicated to serve local population, both in electricity but also in digital bridge, education and health.
Thank you. Your final thoughts on?
Yeah, so you were just mentioning that there is a lot of needs, like $2.6 trillion required for us to meet the SDGs and then stay on the path to net zero. So to do so, I think there are really a couple of things that we need to look at. One of them is how do we create bankable projects? Because the money is there, but then are the projects viable? So in doing so, there is a lot to do. There is engagement, there is, working both the private and public sector. And in addition to bankable project, it's also important to use blended finance, more of the blended finance as a way of de-risking projects. So I will stop there.
Thank you, David.
Well, number one, I agree with you, 100%. And number two, I think, maybe just to add to that, the emerging markets are in a very, very different situation from the developed world. And amongst emerging markets, they're extremely different situations. And one thing I think that we need to do is maybe depoliticize a little bit the whole situation, because human needs, I think, prevail over. I'm not saying that political considerations or geopolitical considerations can be set aside. I'm not saying that at all. But I am saying that human needs, and what we see at the moment is a lot of tussling amongst international organizations, China, the whole China-Washington thing. So I think the more we can bring things together so that at least for the least developed markets in the world, they get the required infrastructure and support, I think that will be very helpful. Effectively, coordination.
And more of continuity of that support as well, of course. Thank you so much to all the speakers, and thank you for being here with us for the session. Thank you.